Have you ever found yourself in a situation that you didn't sign up for? And maybe it was a job that came with expectations that you weren't expecting. Or in school, maybe it was a class that you accidentally walked into. Or in life, maybe it's a relationship that required more than you were able to give, right? You know, those situations where you wish, man, I just wish I would have asked more questions. In the early years of my youth ministry days, before Risa and I had kids and she still worked full-time outside of the home, I basically had Fridays to myself, and I would sleep in, I would watch movies, play video games, like all the normal stuff you'd imagine a 20-something guy would do with his time. But believe it or not, I found myself starting to get bored. So I began looking for any and all kind of part-time work to fill like that Friday time slot with. And around the holidays, I thought the perfect opportunity presented itself. I could be a holiday extra for UPS helping to deliver packages. I mean, what kind of better way to spend a Friday, I thought, than riding on a truck, listening to sports radio, and earning some money on the side. So I applied for the position and got invited to a half-day orientation training. And all was going as planned until the manager started to describe the job we were all there to apply for. And this wasn't like a part-time when you're available type of gig. Like this was full-time, long days type of work that wouldn't end until the last package was delivered on Christmas Eve. And well, that was not what I was expecting. Hey, this was a situation I didn't sign up for. So I sheepishly sat through that whole orientation. And when they brought us into the manager's office one by one for the in-person interview, I quickly shared my situation, like I've already got a full-time job and that this was not going to work. So I wasted a half of a Friday because I didn't ask enough questions. And today we're beginning a brand new series that's really unlike anything we've done since I've been at Oasis. It's a series of messages called Christianity for People Who Aren't Christians. And I've got a few goals in mind with this series. The first is to try and explain the Christian faith in a way that doesn't assume that you kind of have it all figured out. Because believe it or not, most people today don't have a foundational knowledge or understanding of the Christian faith. Many weren't raised in a Christian home, or if they were unchurched and unschooled on the Christian faith. So I'm not going to assume coming into this series that you've got an undergraduate degree in biblical studies. Okay, another one. I'd like to try and answer some of the more common questions that people standing outside of the Christian faith ask based on what they do know or understand about it. These are good questions, fair questions, reasonable questions, questions that should be asked. And my final goal is that for those who are following Jesus, you'll benefit from this conversation too. This is for us as well. Because while you are a person of faith, I'll bet you still have aspects of the Christian faith you've never fully understood, or questions that may have remained unanswered. Because you can have doubts even as you believe. And I'm willing to bet on top of that these are questions you may have been asked. So it's good to see ways we can faithfully enter into these conversations. And the inspiration for this series, it's a book by theologian and pastor James Emery White called the same thing, Christianity for People Who Aren't Christians. And it covers way more than we're going to look at in these next 4 weeks. But if this is a topic, if this is something you'd like to dig more into, I would encourage you to grab that book and give it a read. And if I could sum up the message today in a big question, okay, it would be this. Who is God? Have you ever tried to wrap your mind around God? Like how does he stand right outside of time, no beginning, no end? And how does someone just kind of speak and then something is created out of nothing? I mean, I know when I try to wrap my brain around these things, it hurts. There's not enough computing power up there to answer those kinds of questions. But that doesn't stop us from wrestling with who God is. Whether you reject or accept the existence of God, most of us have a picture of God that we have drawn in our minds, usually based on a series of ideas, feelings, and past experiences from our life. And I'll never forget one of our former youth students, ironically named Christian, who had a difficult upbringing and an absent father. And I remember one summer I was sharing a message on God as his father, and right during the middle of that message, Christian got up and he stormed out of the room. I had no idea what was going on. It wasn't until after the service that we had a chance to talk. And his comment was something to the effect of this: if God is a father, I want nothing to do with that. I've had enough father in my life. You see, his picture of God was distorted by the idea of what his father wasn't. Could it be that we have a distorted mashup of the nature of God in our own heads based on some selective scenes of the world in which we live? See, when it comes to our picture of who God is it a good picture? Is it the right one? Is it a fair one? And particularly, are we getting his nature right? The kind of God he is. Is he moral? Does he have integrity? Is he loving? You see, so many aren't so sure. In fact, most people who reject the idea of God don't reject the possibility of his existence. They reject what they think they know about him. I mean, if he's so strong and powerful, why is the world such a messed up place? And if he's supposed to be so good and loving, then why is there so much suffering in the world? And why has he let it go on for so long? Why doesn't he just step in and stop it? I'm sure there are those who look at the state of our world and think, man, if I was God, the world would be a better place. And this one blogger put it this way: if I was God, the following words and phrases would not exist: war, hunger, drugs, murder, disease, poverty, rape, poor, fight, genocide, famine, jealousy, slavery, homeless, conflict, hate, natural disaster, greed, crime, oppression, victim, gun, third world, accident, weapon, atrocity, bomb, abortion, molestation, dictator, steal, mental illness, sorrow, kill, sadness, loneliness, death, anger, apology, old, need, evil, cancer. And then the last word he puts down is hell. See, that's all this blogger sees when he looks at the world. That's the lens that he views God through. That's how he's judging God. But is that all there is to the story? It reminds me of George Buttrick. He was the former chaplain at Harvard. And when he would talk about how students would come into his office and they'd say, I don't believe in God, he would then say this: okay, sit down and tell me what kind of God you don't believe in. I probably don't believe in that God either. So let's look a bit more closely at what distorts how so many view who God is. The realities of evil and suffering. Okay, it's the most spiritually persistent question people ask across every world religion, every philosophy, every worldview. It's this: is why is there evil and suffering in the world? Okay, now this is not a question that the Christian faith alone must answer. You see, if you reject Christianity because of the existence of suffering in the world, then you need to reject every philosophy, every worldview, every ideology, every religion, because the reality of suffering is not just unique for Christianity to explain. I don't care if you're a Buddhist, a Muslim, a Mormon, a Sikh, a Hindu, or nothing at all. Everyone must answer the question about why this is such a broken world. You see, even atheists need to wrestle with that question. In fact, it's actually one of the biggest arguments against atheism. You see, atheists may not believe in God, but they believe in the inherent goodness of human beings and in the inevitable upward progression of naturalistic evolution. And what that means is that human beings should be becoming increasingly good and noble and peaceful and humane. Right? As we advance in education and politics and technology, that in theory it would mean that our world should be becoming a better place every day. But listen, we know it's not. Yet there's a reason that this question about evil and suffering is often laid solely at the feet of Christianity more than any other faiths. Why? Well, the Bible teaches that God is all-powerful, that he's able to do anything he wants. And further, the Bible teaches that God is thoroughly good, not mean or vindictive. Yet, what do we know? Bad things happen. There is suffering in the world. And for many, many people, those dynamics, they just don't mix. Right? If God is all good and all powerful, he shouldn't allow bad things to happen. And since they do happen, people then decide either God isn't good at all or he isn't all powerful. So let me try and give the Christian answer, the answer the Christian faith gives to the question of evil and suffering. And it's really more of a story than some textbook answer. So let me see if I can tell you that story in its essence. And it really begins, like any good story, begins with once upon a time. You see, once upon a time, God made humanity in order to love us. Now, don't race past that. Okay, that's everything. That's the heart of the story. That is the great human drama that is unfolding around us. You see, there was a God who created, and he created for the purpose of relationship, to know him and be known by him. See, you and I, we are tenderly crafted and designed, each as an individual, for the purpose of being related to, known, and cherished. Now, obviously, if it's going to be in that kind of relationship, God needed to make it real and authentic, not something fabricated. You see, that's why he didn't just make us robots who are programmed to love him back. We were given the freedom to make choices with our life, to live as fully conscious, self-determining beings, even to the point of whether we choose to respond to the Creator's love. You see, God did not choose to seduce us against our will. Instead, he determined to woo us, knowing that in doing that, we might very well turn away. But this was the only way to have the relationship be a relationship. This is the dynamic at the heart of human existence. We are created for a relationship with God. We either enter into that relationship or we don't. God could have made me love him, but if he had, his relationship with me and mine with him would be absolutely meaningless. You see, God wants our relationship with him, and he wants it to be real. So when he created you and me, he had to take the risk of setting us free. The first instance of this freedom to choose was, as you might expect, it was made by the first humans, Adam and Eve. Now, we could have, a great conversation about how God got to that first pair and all the science and everything related to creation, but we'll just kind of stay focused and start right with this story of Adam and Eve, which is really where our story does begin. You see, when they were placed in the Garden of Eden, God gave them one and only one directive. It was as if he said this: look around, look at all that I've made. This is paradise. You can run free, create, dream, build. You can drink from any stream and eat from any tree, just not that one. You see, the whole planet is yours, just not that one single tree. Don't eat from that one. Now, it could have been anything God set aside. The point was he set up something to create choice. He set up something to create freedom. Hey, will you follow me or not? Will you let me lead you or not? Are you going to obey me or not? It's all your call. I want it to be real between us, so let's use a tree. That's just what God did. Then in the midst of that perfection, in the midst of all that they had, what did Adam and Eve choose? They chose to eat the fruit from that tree. They made the conscious, purposeful decision to go against the love, against the relationship. They could have had life in intimacy with God, living in a world under his leadership in direction and protection, or they could have a life separated from him, living in a world outside of his leadership and outside of his direction and protection, right? There's plan A or there's plan B, and they chose B. And when they did that, it ushered sin and evil onto the stage, as well as the consequences of sin and evil. Almost like the unleashing of a disease that spread from human to human. And we've been making the same decision ever since. You see, every single one of us has made the same choice over and over again. The same choice Adam and Eve did. Every single one of us has chosen to go against God, to sin, to disobey. So what does that mean? Evil and suffering is simply what erupts when we live apart from God. It's what flows into the world apart from God. It's everything that happens to the world and to our life apart from God. When we choose against God, all hell broke loose, literally. The decision the first humans made to reject God's leadership and ongoing intimacy within a relationship with him, it radically altered God's original design for how the world would operate and how life should and could be. And theologians over the years have termed this the fall. They talk about how we now live in a fallen world. You see, we live in a world that is not the way God intended it to be. And we've been turning away from God ever since. And the results of our collective choice to turn away from God, they run so deep that it isn't just moral evil that we face, but natural evil as well. And the Apostle Paul says the whole world is sick. He writes in the New Testament book of Romans how all of creation is groaning under the collective choice of our sin. That's why we have earthquakes and tidal waves, volcanoes, mudslides, wildfires like we're seeing right now, and birth defects, famine, AIDS. Hey, this raises a really difficult idea. That God is not behind what is tragic with this world, much less responsible for it. Humanity is. And this leads to the million-dollar question of, well, why doesn't God just step in and end it all? Be so glad he hasn't. If tonight God wiped out all of evil, all wrongdoing, every person who committed harm against another, how many of us would live to see tomorrow? Yeah, I know I wouldn't. Could God wipe out all evil, all suffering this very moment? Yes, he could, but he doesn't. And the reason he doesn't is because of his love for people like you and me. And that reminds me of the words of the Apostle Peter in the New Testament letter of 2 Peter 3, verse 9. He says this, "The Lord isn't really being slow about his promise, as some people think. No, he is being patient for your sake. He does not want anyone to be destroyed, but wants everyone to repent." You see, he's patient, so much more so than we could ever begin to understand. Why? Because of his love. And this book that we're using as the guide for this series tells a story about a father who was in conflict with his 15-year-old daughter. Okay, maybe you can relate to that. And she was consistently coming home late into the night, or even some nights not coming home at all. As parents, he and his wife had tried various forms of punishment, but nothing seemed to make much of a difference. Their daughter lied to them, deceived them, and always found a way to turn the tables on them, blaming her behavior on them for being so strict. Okay, one night in particular, this father stood in front of the window in his living room like he had done so many other times, staring out into the darkness, waiting for his daughter, hoping for his daughter to come home. And he was so frustrated. He was so angry with his daughter for the way she manipulated him and his wife, and had constantly tried to find ways to hurt them. He was also upset because he knew she was hurting herself more than anyone else. And in that moment, he understood more than ever before the passages in the Bible where God expressed frustration. Passages talking about how the people knew how to wound God and how God would cry out in pain. And yet, this father said, when my daughter came home in the wee hours of the morning, I wanted nothing more in the world than to take her in my arms, to love her, to tell her how I wanted the best for her. He says, I was a helpless, lovesick father. Have you ever thought about God as a lovesick father? A God who's standing in the front window, gazing achingly into the darkness, waiting for his child to come home. But listen, he isn't just waiting. He entered into an all-out search and rescue mission. He's invested himself in the process of healing the wounds that come from our choices by entering into the suffering process with us in order to lift us out of it. See, the heart of the Christian faith is that God himself came to planet Earth in human form in the person of Jesus, and he suffered. He knows about pain. He knows about rejection. He knows about hunger, injustice, and cruelty because he has experienced it himself. Jesus on the cross was God entering into the reality of human suffering, experiencing it just like we do, in order to demonstrate that even when we used our free will to reject him, his love never ended. This was not suffering for its own sake, but suffering so that we might use our free will to choose again, only this time making the right choice. Frederick Buechner put it this way: like a father saying about his sick child, I'd do anything to make you well. God finally calls his own bluff and does it. and he held out his hands and took the nails. The ultimate deliverance, the most significant healing, the most strategic rescue has come. Our greatest and most terrible affliction has been addressed. God has given us the greatest answer to our questions. He's given us himself. He's going to keep giving himself to any and all who will turn to him until the end of time. And yes, time will eventually come to an end. God is patient, but at some point it will come to an end. And a missionary was once asked what Jesus will say when he returns to the earth, because Jesus himself said he would return at the end of all things. And this missionary thought about it for a second, and then he remembered a verse in the Bible that says that Jesus will come down from heaven with a commanding shout. And of course, they wanted to know, what is Jesus going to shout when he comes back? And the missionary thought about it for a moment, and then it came to him. And he said this, enough. Jesus will shout, enough. Enough suffering, enough starvation, enough terror, enough death, enough indignity, enough lives trapped in hopelessness, enough sickness, and enough disease. At the end, when he returns, Christ will shout, enough. And that's a story that you should know. And it raises the real question when it comes to our broken, messed up world. Will pain and suffering, will it drive you away from God? Or will it drive you to him? And I love how the psalmist sort of speaks to God's character in Psalm 103 verse 8. He says this, the Lord is compassionate and merciful, slow to get angry, and filled with unfailing love. You see, that is who God is. And if you want to know what he looks like, look no further than Jesus. And next week, we're going to dig into the question about who Jesus is. As I wrap up this message, I have just a few next steps. The first is become a follower of Jesus. See, have you carried a distorted view of who God is? Do you look at the brokenness of life, the difficult things in this world, and do you allow those to warp who God is? You see, the reality is God is that lovesick Father who's removed every barrier that would keep us from coming to him. You see, he did something about sin and death. And in Jesus, we can be made new. We can be brought close into a real relationship with him. If that's your desire today, would you let someone in your home church know? We'd love to pray for you and help you take next steps in what it means to follow Jesus. Final next step is this, is listen to the stories around you. I want you to try an experiment this week. Hey, pay attention to the stories others are sharing about who God is. Consider how their personal experience, their view of the world shapes that view. And maybe even listen to your own story. Do you catch certain things about how you view God? What might be shaping that view? You see, these are important questions not only for those who are exploring Christianity, but also for those who are following Jesus. God bless Oasis.